Hello everybody, this is Hammer Striker here. Today we got one of our SIG P320s back from the voluntary upgrade. We had sent two of them off on Tuesday of last week, which would have been the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, and they were delivered to SIG on Black Friday, the day right after Thanksgiving. And the first one came back today, which is Friday, exactly a week after they received it. And the other one is, I just got notifications en route, it's going to be back on Monday. Happily, they sent back the TAC ops, which is a 9mm, and we had held back this 9mm to do kind of the before and after. So I'm going to show you what they changed and show you what I believe is the components that are involved in the voluntary upgrade and what they're doing to make it safe. This little thing here, by the way, is a super high security zip tie that they had zip tied the case back with. So on the way back inside the box, it was inside the Sig Sauer box that I sent it in, and they zip tied it with this thing, which almost immediately fell victim to my knife. So we'll throw that aside. I sent the gun back in just the case. So I had the original Sig Sauer case, like this one, and I set the gun in there with no chamber flag, and so basically, like, take this unloaded one. When I sent it back, it looked just like that. There was nothing else in the box, no baggie, no nothing, just the gun, no magazine, which is the way they wanted it sent. When it came back with the gun in this plastic bag with a chamber flag and a new packet of stuff. This is basically the same thing that comes in the gun when it's new. I noticed it's X series, the manual is X series, and it came with a few things in it. Of course, you got the Handgun Safety Act notice, a Sig Sauer patch that came with it, a 25% off single-use coupon for your next order from the SIG store. So unlike Ruger and a few others that have given a free magazine, sorry for our mistake, SIG is giving you a 25% off discount, and a P320 patch. So all of this was in what was returned to me, and this may be, the patch didn't come in the original box, but I'm thinking possibly they provide the patches now. So let's move on and talk about the functional changes they made to the gun. So I do have two here. I've got the P320 TAC ops that I sent back and another 9mm. Externally, the big difference you'll notice is the trigger. There's the trigger on the modified version of it, and you notice how thin it is. By comparison, there's the original trigger. So it really does stand out. It doesn't even need micrometers or any other measuring devices to see it. It really stands out. They're both still metal triggers, the original and the new one. And what they've done is they've lightened up the trigger, even to the point of drilling a little hole in the bottom of it to lighten it. It's right up in there. And you'll see that a little more clearly when I pull the chassis out, which will be the next step. I'll pull the chassis out. But what they've done is they've taken steps to lighten the trigger to reduce inertia. When the gun hits, the trigger's mass wants to keep going this way, so the trigger basically self-pulls. And that little dingleberry you see on Glocks and Walthers and a lot of the others goes to a blocking mechanism that jams the trigger unless that's depressed, and the springs work in the opposite direction. So most other guns of striker guns like this without a mechanical safety take care of that self-pulling trigger with that little dingleberry. SIG chose not to adopt that, so they've lightened the trigger. But there's no changes made to the frame, and when I had talked to SIG, they said they were not going to modify the frames. They just needed the frame to be able to function test the gun. So I sent it with one of the, we've got several frames for these things, but I just put it in one of the frames and sent it, and as promised, they did not modify the frame. Well, let's take the gun apart and let's talk about what they did modify. We'll get rid of this chamber flag. This one has always been stiff to turn, and it has nothing to do with what they've done. So I'm going to take the TAC ops, which is the modified gun, apart, and I'm going to pop the unmodified gun apart so we can set them side by side. So I'm going to start with the slide, because the change to the slide really stands out. What they've done is they've milled a notch right here, basically a little well into the slide. Now, disappointingly, they didn't do any surface treatment or finish on it, So they just basically cut into the metal. So I will have to make sure I keep that area oiled, or you'll start to get some corrosion there. And by comparison, the original slide in that area was just smooth, and I'll put them side by side. So when you have them side by side, it really stands out. That notch, actually, it's kind of hard to show it on camera, but it's actually a recess. It goes down into the slide. So they bored into the metal, and they basically had a ramp. So it's deeper at the back of the slide and shallower at the front, and acts like a little bit of a ramp. And the significance of that is this little component right here. This little guy right here. And this moves up and down. And that is a new component that does not exist on the prior version. Side by side, you'll see that part doesn't exist on the original version. So let me get the frame, the chassis out, and I'll do that off camera because I know you guys have done the, if you've got P320s, you've done this 100 times. Let me get the chassis out so we can look at them a little more closely. So I've got them apart. I've got the two chassis in my hand. This one is the modified TAC Ops. This one is the unmodified original one. And there's a couple things that stand out fairly quickly. One is this little, like housing that goes around the fire control group, this black piece that has the visible part that you see at the back. There's a section missing here, and on this side as well, there's a section missing right up in here. Now this section that's missing, it's obvious why. It's to accommodate this new disconnector component. The section over here that's missing, I'm really not sure what purpose it serves. It looks like they replaced it rather than milling it, so I believe they actually replaced this component. And one thing I will note, this is my original chassis. This is the serialized part. If they had replaced this entirely, it would get a new serial number, and we'd have to go through the whole background check, FFL transfer part again. We didn't have to go through that because they sent me my original part. They can modify or replace components, but the actual part with the serial number, they had to send me back the same one. You'll notice that this one has a little hump right here, which is the unmodified one, and the modified one is missing that hump. I don't believe that actually served any real purpose, and when you look at it, it's shiny, so you can tell they actually ground or cut or otherwise removed that piece. So, and this was right here on this one. And then of course you've got this disconnector, which kind of pushes up and down. My fingers are blocking it because I'm squeezing it, but I'll show you the part in a second, what that operates. Other than that, those are really the significant changes that you can see. There's a little bit of a difference in the sear component, the width of it and the shape of it. So they did replace that component as well. Now, if you're looking at one of these and you're trying to quickly ascertain whether or not it's a modified or non-modified, either looking at the thinness of the trigger or looking for this is the fastest way to get there, because that part it obviously stands out. It wasn't there before. From a compatibility standpoint, the modified chassis requires a modified slide to function. Because on the slide all they did is cut a notch in it, they didn't actually, there's the unmodified one, and then the modified one. They didn't make any changes to the sear components or the drop safety on the slide. So you can put a modified slide on an unmodified chassis and it'll function, but you can't go the other way around. So let's put the unmodified one aside for a moment and look at this one here and the changes of the functionality on the modified version. Basically all this thing does is push down on the disconnector. The disconnector was there all along on the original version as well, but there was nothing to externally operate it. And this is basically just part of the function that prevents it from being full auto. It makes it semi-auto. Well, if you lock the disconnector down, then effectively you disable the trigger. That's what the disconnector briefly does during the cycling of the gun. And with this modification, what'll happen is the only way that thing can be up, in the up or enabled or connected position, is if it's in this notch. If it's anywhere else in the cycling of the gun, it will forcibly push the disconnector down. Now at first I thought, okay, well that's part of the drop safety mechanism, but as I got analyzing it, and I'll show you when I put the gun back together again, I don't see how this is actually able to participate in the drop safety, because at the point in time you would drop the gun, it would be in battery, the slide would be in position, the notch would be over this, so it would be in the up position. So what I'm thinking is going on here is they had found that the military submission trial guns did not exhibit that behavior, and one of many things that was different was the trigger, and they just completely went to that fire control group. I don't really believe that either this notch here or this little component actually stalls the drop it at the wrong angle kind of situation. It's probably related to some of the other functionality that they did for the military, and they just said, we'll go with that because we know it works. I don't have inside information on that, but that's what the evidence is kind of bringing me to. So let me put this back together, and I will show you the reasons I don't think this participates in it, and then we'll talk a little bit about, well, what's the big deal with the lighter trigger. One quick note before I put it back together, and this may or may not be easy to see on camera. See this stripe right through here? That's a wear mark where that new component, that new little protrusion right here, is sliding along the slide. I expect the finish to wear off on that stripe, because it's already quite visible, and only with the amount of cycling that SIG did to test it and what I've done playing around with it here. I haven't taken it to the range and fired it yet. So I'm thinking, keeping a little, like a drop of oil on that one component to help minimize this is probably going to be something I'm going to want to do. The other thing I'll note is these various little holes that you see here are lightening cuts, and you'll find different size ones with different weights and lengths of slides. I also have to clean this thing. So these don't have anything to do with it. These cutouts and notches and things like that are just part of making sure that this particular slide weighs the correct amount of weight for the weight of the springs and the 9mm or 40 or 45, whatever round the slide's built for. A couple people had noticed these on a few different guns, and they looked different. They will. They'll look different depending on the size of the slide, which model you've got, and things like that. They're not part of the picture. So now I'll put it back together, and we'll talk about how that may or may not be part of the overall drop safety solution. So now that I've got it back together, let's talk briefly about the mechanics of how these various parts would play into improving the drop safety of the gun. When you have something that falls, it has momentum, it has energy, and it wants to keep going until something stops it. So when the gun hits, so we'll have it hit at some kind of an angle, it'll hit on the beaver tail in this case. Beaver tail is a solid hit. So the frame and anything firmly attached to the frame is going to stop, which is going to include the chassis and the frame. It's going to stop immediately because it's hit a hard stop. But anything that's movable will continue to move. The trigger has weight and mass, and it will continue to move downward. And that if you have the trigger's mass pulling downward and you have the springs have taken a hit, they're vibrating. That's what springs do when they receive an impulse, like a pulse like that. Same concept that makes a guitar or a piano work. When the springs are in that state, they have significantly less resistance. They're not as powerful of a spring, and they can actually even stop being a spring. So let me make sure I got this cycled. So when it hits, the trigger's own mass coupled with the vibrating springs will pull itself. Well, on this gun and many others, when you pull the trigger, it automatically disables the drop safety. If the trigger is pulled, the drop safety is disabled as part of that cycle. So if the trigger pulls itself, the gun will fire. So when I saw that new extra component, I thought, well, maybe that also plays a part in it, because what it's got is there's a little notch back here that if it's not in battery, so if the slide, which also has mass, actually significantly more than the trigger, is moving because it hasn't stopped yet, and there's enough energy to overcome the springs, maybe the gun will be a little bit out of battery, like I've got it there. That little thing won't be in its slot, and the trigger will not be able to pull itself and fire the gun. Well, that turns out not to be true. Not only does it fire, but it actually tries to push itself back into battery. Now you've seen, like the FN509 that we showed, that actually has out-of-battery protection. It actually has devices that prevent the slide if the slide's not in perfectly in battery, the fire control group is disabled. I thought that's what this was going to be on this gun. Turns out not to be. You can actually get it significantly out of battery and still get it to fire. If I get it way out, it won't fire. But if I get it just a little bit out, which is probably what would happen during a drop, it's going to bounce and then the springs are going to bring it back. It's during that bounce that you would want to catch it. You can still fire the gun. Now, don't worry about the gun not being safe from out of battery. At that point, it's still locked up. It isn't until you get all the way about here that it unlocks. So even this far out of battery, it's still in the locked state. It's not going to blow up in your face. That's not yet another issue with the gun. But that component doesn't appear to have any viable function in the drop safety mechanism. So in all honesty, I think it really just comes down to the trigger's lighter. There's less energy and less mass to keep moving to push it out of battery. So the next question that's going to come to mind is, well, did they wreck the trigger? So take the two guns, you pull the trigger, there's your take up on the unmodified gun. Real crisp, short break. I really do like the P320's trigger. And not the shortest reset on the planet, but a nice reset. It's almost all the way out, but the overall trigger stroke is short enough that that is a decent reset. So that's the unmodified gun. Now let's go to the modified gun. Same basic amount of take up. Little bit of creep, just a hair, but a pretty crisp break. And then a similar reset. Now in that case I kind of let it bounce, so let's do this again. There's the reset. Now one thing I do notice that coming back out, the trigger's a little bit more bouncy, is lack of a better description for it. And that may be with less mass, it's not able to control itself quite as well. So the reset doesn't feel quite as crisp on the modified trigger. But overall, the changes between these two triggers is nothing you're going to notice at the range. It's not going to affect the ability to get good clean follow-up shots. And no, I don't believe they did wreck the trigger. From a weight perspective, the weight feels just about the same. This one just feels a hair crisper. Now, one thing I will note, when we've got 2 or 3 of these things, and we've seen variations even before this voluntary upgrade, we've seen variations between individual pistols on the feel of the trigger. So the triggers on these aren't super consistent to start with. So overall, I don't think they've wrecked the trigger. I do think they've made some changes that are just to bring it consistent with something they're already building that they've tested for the military and it's passed the military tests. Some of these changes I don't think relate to the drop safety issue at the moment. And they've lightened the trigger in an attempt to really, I think that's the real mitigation to the drop safety issue. In all reality, they probably should just go ahead and go with the split trigger like Glock, Walther, Smith & Wesson. Well, Smith & Wesson has the hinge trigger, but basically go with some sort of a positive block that has a spring that operates in an opposite direction of the other springs. So if you have an impact that sets one set of springs singing, it won't affect the other one, because springs are definitely directional in how they're affected by an impulse. And what you effectively end up with on those guns is 2 sets of springs that are necessary to be overcome, only one of which can get put into that vibrating state by an impact. So we're going to send out this one here and get this one taken care of. Our 45 will be arriving Monday. When the 45 gets here, if we notice anything unusual about it, if we've already released this video, I'll do a quick follow-up. Otherwise, we'll add it to the end of this one before we go through final production. And if I see anything different that they've done with that, my expectation is that'll be the exact same thing. So if you haven't sent your gun in, go ahead and send it in. It does improve to some extent the drop safety and some of the other upgrades that bring it consistent with the version they've got for the military. And it is definitely worth doing the safety upgrade to improve the overall safety of the gun. But beyond that, get it upgraded, take it to the range, enjoy it, have fun. If you like our videos, please give us a thumbs up, share, subscribe, check us out on Facebook, and have a great day. Thank you.